All right, class, good morning and welcome back to the lecture. Coming back to you from the same time as your previous chapter 19 lecture. In fact, it's just about an hour after I recorded the last one. So it's about 8 p.m. on Thursday night of last week, and I'm probably still in Mexico enjoying the beach. So sorry, I think you guys have probably had some more snow by now if the forecast by now is correct. So once again, I'll be thinking of you guys as I'm sitting on the beach, enjoying a nice cold drink. So, all right. So a little bit of housekeeping before we pop into the lecture for today. So if you take a look at the screen right here in the Unit 10 schedule, we are going to start Chapter 20 today and have the Chapter 20 lecture. So just a reminder that tonight, Chapter 20 reading guide is going to be due. And then looking at tomorrow, you guys will be taking a look at something called the Settlement House movement and doing another Stanford reading, like a historian activity. And the Chapter 20 quiz, which will be a take-home, will be due at the end of the day tomorrow. So the end of the day, Friday. So just like the Chapter 19 quiz, that's going to be on Google Classroom, and you will be able to look at the password there and just complete the quiz on your own time. So, before we get started, we probably have to take a look at our moral support. Our kitty who has been having the allergy problems is out. However, we still have one little friend down there. This is the cat that walked in front of the screen earlier, and that's my cat right there. So anytime I'm sitting in the office, he's usually sitting right in that corner. Doesn't look mad anymore. He just looks like he's kind of resigned to his fate. It's 8:14, which is usually about his bedtime. So he's probably going to take a nap in the back as we do the lecture. So once again, moral support from our fuzzy friends. So we are going to get started with the Chapter 20 lecture. And when we left off last week, we were talking about two big trends. The first being the populist movement and the agrarian revolt, where the Grange and the Farmers Alliance morph into the People's Party, the populist movement, and that the populist movement exerts a pretty big influence on national politics, but ultimately loses in the election of 1896. When they fuse with the Democratic Party. So the traditional parties kind of win out. And then we finished up talking about imperialism and the U.S. joining the ranks of the global imperial powers, and how in 1898 the Cuban crisis, right, not the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the actual Cuban crisis, gets the United States involved in the Spanish-American War, and how we come out of that war gaining lots of the imperial, or the former imperial colonial possessions of the Spanish Empire, and that the United States goes from, kind of has this identity crisis, right, where we go from being, or think of ourselves as sort of this democratic, republican country, and now we have colonial possessions of our own, right? So it's a very different sort of way that we think about ourselves. And we identified that year, 1898, in the Spanish-American War as a major turning point in U.S. history. And in fact, kind of the marker that moves us from one period of a push to the next period. So that's where we're hopping in with Chapter 20 right here. And this is going to be about something called the progressive movement. So the time frame that we're looking at in Chapter 20 with the progressive movement is right at the year 1900 until 1914, when World War I is going to start. So again, the dates on this are kind of fuzzy. Generally, we give the year 1900 as the kind of the starting date for the progressive movement, although certainly aspects of this were going on, several years before. And then some historians even take the progressive movement all the way up through the 20s. I tend to stop it right around 1914, which is when we start focusing on World War I. But, again, these dates are all fluid. So looking at the overview here, Progressivism, the progressive movement, emerged in the late 1890s as the broadest response yet to the problems created by the economic and social trends of the late 19th century. The progressive movement was incredibly broad and diverse, and there are many competing definitions and classifications of the progressive movement. In general, however, it is safe to say that progressives valued expertise and vigorous government and sought to use those things as tools to fix the myriad social problems afflicting the United States. Reform efforts dominated American politics for the first 2 decades of the 1900s and resulted in lasting political changes such as women's suffrage and a vigorous presidency. So this, when you compare progressivism to the populist movement of the late 1800s, progressivism is going to be bigger, it's going to be a broader movement, it's going to have a stronger political impact at the time, and it's also going to result in far longer and far more permanent changes to the American political system than the populist movement. So the populist is going to kind of be like a flash in the pan. The progressivism is going to enact some really lasting structural changes. So over on the right-hand side of the picture, is a lady by the name of Jane Addams. And Jane Addams is going to be one of many women that are highly influential in this progressive movement. And we'll talk about it in a bit, but Jane Addams was primarily concerned with the urban poor and helping them find their way and learn to live a better lifestyle. So without further ado, let's talk about the progressives. So we've mentioned progressivism several times now, and I haven't really taken the time to explain what progressivism actually is. So let's take a slide here to talk about progressivism and what that term means. So progressivism is going to be really similar to populism. And we talked about populism last chapter, and I defined populism as a political ideology that focused on your common people, right? It tried to enact laws and acts and do things that helped your common, average, everyday person. So our contemporary example of populism was Donald Trump with the Make America Great Again policy. In the 1800s, though, the populism primarily focused on Western farmers and dealing with the plight of the Western farmers. Progressivism is going to be an ideology very similar to populism, and they're going to sound very similar to one another, but there are some really important differences and distinctions between progressivism and populism. So progressivism as an ideology also tries to fix the myriad of social problems that were happening in the United States at the end of the 1800s. So wealth inequality, concentration of economic power, urban poverty, these things that populism also saw, progressivism saw as well. So both progressivism and populism are going to try to address these problems, but in different ways. So progressivism is going to look at the issues afflicting the United States in the late 1800s and early 1900s, sort of the Gilded Age issues. And progressives are going to mostly diagnose these issues as problems with the concentration of economic wealth. So what progressives are going to think is that because of this laissez-faire hands-off approach and the social Darwinism, that these huge corporations and these business tycoons have so much power in society that the only way to fix the problems that are happening, the wealth inequality and so on, is to use the government to do so. So as an ideology, if you want a succinct definition that you can write down, progressives favor using the government as a tool to fix society's problems. In other words, to use the government as a tool to promote social progress. Okay? So the other thing to know about progressivism is that it is a very broad, loosely connected movement. So there are tons of different types of progressives. There are progressives that focus on one thing versus another thing, and in various elements of the progressive movement kind of come and go at different times. So unlike populism, which was a fairly unified political party, the progressives are a much more broad movement. So some examples of the varieties of progressivism that you see. One type of progressivism is an anti-monopoly progressive. So this is probably the most common type of progressive that we see. And these were progressives that were concerned with the concentration of economic power. They would look at your Rockefellers and your Standard Oils and your Vanderbilts and the corruption of the railroad rates, and they say that big business has gotten too big, too powerful, and they've become a problem in society. So these progressives are focused on economic concentration and the trusts. Other types of progressives are really focused on the benefit that expertise and training and science can provide to society. So these types of progressives would advocate, we call these expertise progressives. These type of progressives would advocate for the government as a tool to fix the problems in society, but they think that the necessary thing that we have to understand the problems and the best solution to those problems is expertise. So progressives are all about having economists look at economic problems and, expert doctors fixing people who are sick, and city managers who are trained in management. So progressives think that through management and expertise we can understand problems and come up with solutions for them. So we have expertise progressives as well. Still, other progressives are looking at reforming different aspects of society, either reforming our political systems to make them more responsive to people and not trusts, or reforming the way society works to enforce certain aspects of morality on society, like the temperance movement, which sought to lower alcohol consumption and enforce sobriety. So these progressives think that there's a better way for people to live, and they want to use the government to try and promote people to adopt those lifestyles. Still, other types of progressives are focused on social justice and social wrongs, so focusing on oppressed groups in society and trying to gain them equal rights. Probably the most popular of this group are, of course, the women's suffrage group. And one of the biggest things that you're going to get out of the progressive unit, or the progressive movement rather, is the 19th Amendment, which is going to grant women the right to vote. So the very first inklings of the progressive movement that you get, sort of the origins of the progressive movement, happen with a group of journalists who start writing about the corruption that they see with these big trusts. And those journalists quickly gained the nickname muckrakers because they're digging up all this dirt from the past of these corporations and trying to publish this dirt in newspapers and magazines to raise awareness of just how corrupt these trusts and companies and capitalists have become. So we call these journalists muckrakers, and they're really going to start to raise awareness of progressive type thinking. And the lady, the picture in the upper right hand of the slide, her name is Ida Tarbell, and she is going to be kind of the first and most prominent of these muckraker journalists. And again, it's notable that she's a woman affecting change. And this is something you're going to see with progressivism, and something that's unique to this is the presence of women in this movement. And women are extraordinarily influential in this progressive movement, and it's interesting and unique. Anyhow, Ida Tarbell is going to be one of these muckraker journalists, and she is going to do a huge write-up on the history of Rockefeller and Standard Oil. And she's going to talk about all these things that Rockefeller did while he was doing horizontal integration and vertical integration. And Rockefeller wasn't just a smart businessman. He was an extraordinarily cutthroat businessman too, and was not afraid to resort to bribery and sort of almost illegally doing like illegal business practices, right? He's very corrupt. And so Ida Tarbell did this exhaustive research and wrote this huge, gigantic series of articles that wind up becoming a book, reporting on the history of Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. And this launches her to fame. It launches sort of this progressive movement into fame. And the magazine that winds up picking up this series of stories by Ida Tarbell is called McClure's Magazine. And McClure's Magazine is going to pull together a handful of these really good muckraking journalists. And this weekly magazine that every week is going to publish an expose of a different corporate story of corporate corruption is going to kind of catapult progressive issues into the forefront of society. So still more talking about more progressive types of progressivism. Jane Addams, who we talked about on that opening slide, is, I think, a good example of another aspect of progressive thought, and that's just how anti-social Darwinist the progressive movement was. So we talked about social Darwinism as this sort of almost bastardized version of biological Darwinism, where we say that society should be hands-off, no rules, sort of this law of the jungle, and the strongest businesses and people will sort of get rich and survive, right? And if the poor don't make it, if the poor don't become wealthy, that's their own fault because they didn't work hard enough. Well, the progressives are going to completely reject that type of thinking, and they are going to sort of advance the train of thought that maybe perhaps urban poverty and urban crime isn't the result of lazy or ineffective workers. Perhaps it's the result of society and the way. Perhaps the real problem with poverty and urban crime and a lot of these issues isn't that the poor aren't working hard enough or aren't making the right decisions. Perhaps it's that the rules of society and the rules of the economy and the political system are set up and being controlled by these powerful one percenters in such a way that prevents many people from rising to the top, no matter how hard they work, no matter how good of decisions they make. So poverty and the problems are a social problem with the structure of society rather than just a personal problem with the poor. So that's going to be kind of a unique way of viewing the world that you get with the progressive movement. All right, next slide. Okay, so the first big section of your textbook in talking about the progressive movement, moving past the description of the progressive ideology, your textbook is going, well, this section is going to focus on women and the impact that women have on the progressive movement. And as I said before, this is one of the things that's really unique to the progressive movement is the critical and central role that women play in this progressive movement. So the women and the influence that they have and the focus that they have in this movement is broad and definitely worth talking about at length. So the key reason that you see women becoming such a central part of the progressive movement is that socioeconomic factors were changing their role within the economy and within society. So we've talked before about this notion that men that kind of starting in the 1700s after the Revolutionary War, men and women were seen to and expected to occupy two different spheres of influence, right? That starting with the first industrial revolution, men were supposed to be the breadwinners working in politics and business, and women were supposed to be in a domestic role, taking care of the house and raising the children. Well, what I mean by socioeconomic factors are sort of the new industrial revolution, the second industrial revolution, is going to change that equation. So several things are going to happen to women, such as with the increasing use of mechanization and corporatization on farming and also in the house. So the rise of like consumer society and household and things like electricity and indoor plumbing and that sort of thing. On both the farm and in urban settings, technology and the second industrial revolution are going to erode or take over the functions that women are supposed to perform in the household, right? So whereas the women are supposed to be taking care of the house and that sort of thing, that those jobs are going to be filled increasingly by tools and technology. So that kind of leaves the women with not a whole lot to do, right? So women by the year 1900 are really searching for an outlet for their creative energies and an outlet for their social passions. And so what starts to happen kind of in the end of the 1800s and by the year 1900s is that women start to come together in more social circles. And in lots of these social circles, their sort of reason for being becomes to fix problems, right? They notice problems in their community and they start to seek to fix them, right? Kind of one of the biggest areas is you get like church women, right? And it's a social club within a church, and these women looking for something to do find something in their community to fix, right? And so that's where you get this grassroots formation of the Progressive Party, and it sort of grows out of these women's groups looking for things in their community that they can fix and help. So that's where you get this notion of club women and social clubs. And it's from these women's clubs, these women's social clubs, that you get these first grassroots progressive movements. So the big issue that the women in the progressive movement focus on is primarily suffrage, right? And suffrage means the right to vote. So this is perhaps the most forefront issue for the women progressives. And the big challenge for women and the progressive and the suffrage movement was that providing women the right to vote in the late 1800s was seen as anathema to this concept of spheres of influence, right? That giving women the right to vote worked against this notion because, remember, politics was dirty and cutthroat, and that was supposed to be the province of men, right? So letting women participate in politics was it was not good for society, right? You need to keep the women, you almost don't want the women to be corrupted by becoming involved in politics. So that was kind of the big thing is people were very wedded to this idea of the spheres of influence concept. Now, over the course of several decades, at the end of the 1800s and into the beginning of the 1900s, progressives, women especially, but certainly some men progressives too, started to push back against this notion. And some of their arguments went like this. The first argument was that women should actually be allowed the right to vote precisely because they are different from men, right? Men are cutthroat and competitive, and they are prone to violence, right? Well, one of the big problems with society is the fact that we are prone to violence. So if you let women vote as well as men, perhaps they will kind of balance out the men and maybe simmer down tensions and provide a calm, maternal presence to voting, right? And maybe this might make politics less cutthroat and less prone to violence, right? So perhaps the fact that women are more domestic means that we should allow them to vote, right? And in fact, that's one of the drivers behind when women ultimately get the right to vote, which is right after World War I, and everybody was horrified with the carnage of the war, and they think, maybe we shouldn't let all the men run the things, right? Maybe we need a women's touch. So this is actually a fairly persuasive argument. Another reason that progressives put forth for giving women the right to vote is that they are people too. And just like men are entitled to their natural rights, women are entitled to the natural rights, just like men are, right? So that, and this is almost like, if blacks are entitled the right to vote, shouldn't we also give women the right to vote too? So women are people too, they're entitled to natural rights such as the right to vote. Finally, and this is a less savory reason that is put forth for giving women the right to vote in around the year 1900, but it's effective nonetheless. And this was used by people who perhaps weren't as progressive for they weren't, it's not as PC, right? But a lot of people argued that women should be given the right to vote precisely because blacks were given the right to vote. And this is because, now we have these blacks that are voting, and they are, we don't want blacks to have the political influence that they would get by voting in large numbers. So you see, so one thing that giving white women the right to vote would be a nice counterbalance to these new black voting blocks. So you see this type of thinking, especially in southern states that want to counteract the blacks that are voting, is, hey, give them to conservative white women so they can, balance out the numbers and keep the blacks from having political control. So not quite as, we don't like that thinking nowadays, but it was effective nonetheless. So women, the suffrage movement has its first successes at the state level. Washington becomes the first state to allow women the right to vote in 1910, and a series of Western states especially are the first ones to do this. However, the national suffrage amendment comes in 1917 when Congress passes the 19th Amendment, and that's what that photo is on the slide, is the cover of that 19th Amendment. Congress passes this in 1917, and it's ratified by the last state in 1920, giving women the right to vote in 1920. So that's one of the many ways that the progressive movement has a lasting political effect, is gaining women the right to vote. Okay, so in addition to gaining women the right to vote and the suffrage movement, another big sort of branch of the progressive movement is going to focus itself on reforming the political system. And remember, progressives, one of the kind of key tenets of progressive ideology is that the government is the best tool to use to enact social progress and social change. So these people are going to be focused on reforming the political system to make it more responsive to fixing people's problems. So taking a look at this topic, one of the things that we see with these political reform progressives is that they're really influenced by the middle class. And typically the middle class didn't like to get involved in politics. It was seen as more of like a, they would vote and stuff, but when it came to like operating political machines and running for office and that sort of thing, it was either an upper class thing because they were the ones who controlled the policy, or it was a lower class thing because they were the ones who were being manipulated by the upper class. So the fact that middle class people really bought into this progressive ideology, and especially sort of northern Protestant middle class people really bought into this notion of political reform. So one of the ways that the progressives look to reform the political system is through making city management, so local government, more efficient and more run better, essentially. So we call this municipal reform. And the big way that the progressive movement is going to push for this is by getting rid of partisan city politicians, right? So instead of electing a Democrat or Republican and having city government be a partisan job, a political job, they're going to advocate that cities instead get rid of mayors and start implementing city managers. And these are non-political people who have been trained trained how to run a city, right? So how to budget for a city, how to make departments in a city, like a water department and a tax department and a parks department, and that you have this city manager who's an expert in running the city rather than a politician, and that cities will be run more efficiently and more effectively this way, right? And again, there we see the progressive value of expertise and training. Progressives are also going to look to reform politics at the state level too. So a few things we're going to do here, a few initiatives, I should say. And the first one is called initiative. And one of the reforms that progressives are going to get passed is a way to sort of do an end around these state legislatures that were largely controlled by the trusts and the capitalist tycoons. And initiative was a way for a citizen to write legislation and introduce this legislation into the legislature, right? So you could have a bill get voted on by the legislature that was actually written by and introduced by a citizen, right? So if you couldn't get a legislature to introduce your bill, you could do it as a citizen, right? Or citizens together could do this. So this was one way to make politics more responsive to your voters and your everyday people. Um, Closely related to initiative was something called referendum, which was a way that citizens could write legislation, just like initiative, but rather than giving it to the legislature to vote on, you could get a number of signatures and actually put this legislation on the ballot for the next election. So people could vote on legislation directly. So if you had legislation that you wanted to get enacted and it was in the good interest of the people, but the legislator was corrupt and not doing it, you could actually just completely bypass the legislature and pass your own legislation, right? More responsive to the people. Another thing that progressives look to do, the direct primary. So one facet of politics in the late 1800s is that party bosses and the parties themselves would select the candidates for office. And as you would expect, the candidates that they select for office are going to work in the interest of the parties and in the interest of the political machines and in the interest of the one percenters, these corporate tycoons. So what the direct primary does, is allows all the members of a party to vote on their next representatives, right? The candidates for government office. So rather than having your bigwigs choose your candidates, the commoners choose the candidates, right? So again, making politics more responsive to the average everyday people. Finally is this reform of recall. So if a politician gets elected and they're corrupt and they're not doing a good job, you have the ability to initiate a recall election, which recalls them from office, kicks them out of office, so you can put somebody in who is going to do a good job. And the primary person who you see, or the most prominent person that you see, the most successful person that you see enacting these state level reforms is a guy named Robert La Follette. And if that name sounds familiar to you, it should, because Robert La Follette is from Wisconsin, right? La Follette High School in Madison is named after Robert La Follette. And La Follette is going to be a politician in Wisconsin who is going to be extraordinarily passionate about enacting these progressive political reforms. So La Follette is, you can kind of see that picture of him on the right side of the slide. La Follette is going to gain this reputation as a guy who's willing to fight the corrupt political powers. In fact, his nickname is going to become Fighting Bob La Follette, right? And he's a really interesting character because he's short, right? You can see in that picture, he's really short. He's like 5'4", but he's got this boundless energy and this tireless work ethic. And he goes all around the state giving these speeches, just like in this picture, sort of railing against corrupt political interests. And he's going to gain enough support that he gets elected governor in Wisconsin. And as governor, he is going to pioneer these different reforms like initiative and referendum and direct primary and that sort of thing. And because under La Follette, Wisconsin is at the forefront of progressive political reforms, Wisconsin is going to gain the nickname as the laboratory of democracy. So interesting piece of local history there with Wisconsin, and we actually have this really strong tradition of progressive politics in Wisconsin. So you lefties in the class, you Bernie Sanders fans, Wisconsin has a long tradition of being progressive, just like that. So moving on down the politics, labor unions kind of surprisingly are hit and miss in their connection with the progressive movements. Samuel Gompers and the AFL were leery of using the political system to gain their rights. They felt that workers could work outside of the political system to gain the things that they wanted to do. However, many goals of labor, the labor movement and the progressive movement, were aligned, and sometimes they did work together, such as getting child labor laws passed to crack down on child labor practices, and also workmen's compensation. So if workers get hurt on the job, then they get monetary support from their job. So both the progressives and labor movements can align on those issues. Interestingly enough, some political machines also do an about face to support the progressive movement. So the fact that the progressive movement was a movement of common people actually kind of had the effect of weakening the grasp of political machines on commoners, right, on your average everyday Americans. And so rather than being able to exploit those everyday Americans, political machines actually adjusted their practices to support progressive policies in order to stay politically relevant. So that's kind of interesting. The most notorious political machine, Tammany Hall in New York, actually becomes a bastion of progressivism in order to maintain its political power. So, okay. So another type of reform that progressives sought to enact was social reform. So by social reform, what I mean is taking a look at social problems that aren't necessarily economic and aren't necessarily political. They're just general problems with the way many people act in society. And as I've mentioned, one really prominent group of progressives were women, especially, but also sort of Protestant middle class women. So women who are very focused on moral issues and the morality and good conduct of society. So many progressives sought to fix immoral behavior in society, and again using the government to do so. So one of the big ways that the progressive movement looks to enact social reform is through the temperance movement, or the tempering or banning of the consumption of alcohol. So many progressives think that a sober society would be the only moral society. And in some cases, they were definitely right, because there were a lot of social problems that were the direct result of how much alcohol people drank. And people back in around the year 1900 drank a lot of alcohol, right? Far more alcohol than people drink today. It was very typical to have, kind of 5 or 6, drinks a day for people. So sobriety was a problem, especially amongst like the working class. Sobriety was a big problem with, sort of immigrants and the urban poor showing up to work late because they've been drinking, or drunk, to factory working, which is a problem. Lots of the poor, especially poor male factory workers, would blow lots of their income on alcohol at the saloons rather than supporting their families. So lots of problems kind of extended from overconsumption of alcohol, and the progressive movement sought to remedy those problems by banning alcohol. So again, temperance, you see a big influence of women, especially because a lot of the problems associated with overconsumption of alcohol affect women more so than men. So a lot of these women's church groupings and clubs really focus their energies on lobbying legislatures and building public support for banning alcohol. So lots of states will start to pass temperance laws before the national government does, but the national government is going to embrace temperance in 1917 with the passage of the 18th Amendment, which is going to ban alcohol, right? And this is going to be ratified in 1920. So this brings in the era that we call prohibition, right? The banning of all alcohol production and consumption in the United States. All right, another way of social reform, right, social problem the progressives are going to look at is immigration. So we've talked already about the ways that immigration was starting to change in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and how new sources or immigrants were starting to come from new places. And you can see by the graph over at the right, if you remember from last chapter, we talked about how kind of, if you look, that upper quarter of the graph was kind of from Southern and Eastern Europe, whereas kind of like the 3/4 of the graph were from the Northern and Western Europe. Well, look at how that immigration is changing, right? If you look at that, almost 22% of immigrants in the year from 1900 to 1920 are going to come from Italy, about 22% from Austria-Hungary, which is again in Southern and Eastern Europe, Russia and the Baltic states, which is in Eastern Europe, and kind of maybe about a third are going to be coming from those traditional sources in Northern and Western Europe. So again, these immigrants are going to be from new places. They're going to tend to be poorer and less educated than the immigrants from the Northern and Eastern part of Europe. And they're going to wind up typically staying in the big cities, in the urban areas, being, working as very poor laborers and that sort of thing. So it's from these immigrant communities in the big cities that you're going to see lots of the urban poverty and urban crime and urban slum type problems. So the progressives definitely looked at this problem of immigration as a way to fix some of the problems in society. And unfortunately, this is probably an area where we don't look back too fondly on the progressives, because a big influence in progressive thinking in this arena was driven by something called eugenics. And eugenics has to do with the study of racial superiority, right? Genetic racial superiority. And unfortunately, the progressive liking for science took kind of a bad turn in this area, because a lot of scientists in this time thought that it was kind of legitimate science to look at the political systems and the economy of especially like Anglo-Saxon type people, so your American and your British, and then your Teutonic or Nordic people, like your Germans and your Scandinavians, and say, look at their cultures, they are more successful, they are clearly racially superior to everybody else. So the progressives would look at this and say, your old stock Americans, your Anglo-Saxons and your Nordics, they're the desirables, they're racially superior, we can look at this scientifically and tell. And so we don't want to have tons of these new immigrants moving in that will mongrelize our society, or in other words, sort of dilute the Anglo-Saxon and Nordic stock, right? So nativism, unfortunately, is going to grow right along with progressivism. And that's kind of a darker side of progressivism that we get. So yet another area that the progressives are going to look to reform is in economic reform. So reforming the economic system. And this is probably going to be the main focus of the progressive movement. This is kind of the, if you look back to the muckrakers and Ida Tarbell, this is kind of the issue that kicks off the progressive movement. And this is where the progressives are going to look at fixing the problems that come from excessive economic concentration and excessive social Darwinism and laissez-faire type governance. So one of the biggest issues that progressives saw was the concentration of economic power in these enormous trusts and under just a small handful of these business tycoons, and how that led to corruption and inefficiency. And the progressives are really going to see that as kind of the main problem that they need to solve. So this is probably the main focus of the progressive movement, is challenging the existing laissez-faire capitalist order. So some elements of and I'm not sure why your textbook does it in this order, but I'll just follow along with what your textbook does. Some elements of the progressive movement are going to embrace aspects of socialism, and the relatively small amount of socialists that live in the United States are going to kind of join up with the progressivism, or the progressive movement. And of course, the socialists, the socialist ideology, are people who want the government to take over ownership of business. So no more private ownership of business. And what that means is that the government is going to step in and basically assume ownership of these great big companies. And of course, the socialists then think if the government owns the businesses, then that's more receptive to the people, right? And they can vote on how the economy should work. But that's a pretty radical solution, and it tends to be a very small part of the progressive movement. Most progressives are not socialists, even though the two ideologies are pretty closely related. Most progressives would argue that capitalism is in general a good thing, right? It raises the standard of living for everybody. The problems that the progressives see with the laissez-faire capitalist order is that it allows this concentration of economic power and allows for corruption to happen. So the real issue for progressives was attacking these monopolies and the rules that allowed these monopolies to form, right? Fighting the centralization of economic power. So the progressives kind of had two main modes of thinking on how to go about this. The first mode of thinking was just that all monopolies, in every instance where these businesses sort of centralize power, that is inherently bad and inherently breeds corruption. So what the government needs to do is just step in and limit the size that businesses can grow to, right? Limit the amount of a certain industry that one company can control. So when you limit the size of businesses, that allows room for lots of different businesses to operate. Then you have competition, right? And competition is good. So one sort of branch of progressive economic thinking is that monopolies and trusts are bad and we can't allow them at all. The other type of economic thinking that progressives have, however, is that big business isn't necessarily bad. And in some cases, having big businesses is good because the bigger a business is, the lower cost the business has, the more efficient it can be, right? Think of like the Walmart effect, right? Walmart can sell goods very cheaply because they're so big, right? So some progressives think that big businesses are okay. The problem is really just that when big businesses use their power in a bad way. So these progressives would say we can allow businesses to be big, but we need to police them. We need to regulate them so that when they start to be corrupt, when they step out of line, that's when we step in and break apart those businesses, right? If a business is big and it operates sort of in a non-corrupt way, that's okay. And so the biggest thinker on this is actually this guy that's on the right hand side of the screen. His name is Louis Brandeis, and he's one of the most outspoken progressives in terms of economic reform. And he's going to be of the camp that says that trusts, if they get big, they're bad, right? So we just don't let big trusts happen at all. Okay, so we spent a lot of time talking about the various aspects of the progressive movement. And as I said before, it's a very broad movement with tons of different parts. So, unlike the populists, the progressives really never unite in a single political party, right? Nevertheless, starting in the year 1901, we get three presidents who, although they're part of the traditional parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, they are going to be true progressive politicians in that they are going to embrace lots of the ideas of the progressive movement. And the first one of these progressive presidents is going to be Theodore Roosevelt. So this is Theodore Roosevelt and the modern presidency. So, we talked a little bit about Theodore Roosevelt when we were talking about imperialism, right? And so this is kind of interesting that you would think that this guy who is all about the United States becoming an imperial power and expanding and conquering new territories, it's kind of weird that he also then turned around and is part of our progressive movement and is concerned with social justice and economic reform. But nevertheless, that's Roosevelt. So Roosevelt is called the accidental president, and his background is really interesting. So Roosevelt grows up in actually a fairly wealthy, politically involved family in New York, and Roosevelt was a really sickly little kid. So he had really severe asthma, and he was really nearsighted. So he had these thick glasses as a kid. And Roosevelt really hated that part of him where he was kind of this sickly, scrawny, like nearsighted, geeky little kid. And so when he was like 13, he just committed himself to improving himself in every way that he could. Physically, so he started working out and doing all like wrestling and taking boxing and that sort of thing. And also mentally. So he read every book that he can get his hand on as a kid. And Roosevelt wound up going on to Harvard, and I think Harvard, might be Columbia, it's some Ivy League school. And he graduates top of his class and winds up becoming the youngest member of the New York State Legislature ever. He was like 22 when he gets elected to the New York State Legislature. And while he was a young politician in the New York State Legislature, Roosevelt went right, again, this is his fighter side coming out. He went right after the big interests, like the corporate interests in New York City. And he wasn't afraid, even as this young politician, to attack the most powerful people in the country. And so Roosevelt kind of gained this reputation as somebody who's willing to attack corruption wherever he sees it, right? So he's going to gain another reputation because he's such a sort of flamboyant and very strong, active, robust personality. He's going to gain a reputation almost like a little bit of a wild kind of politician, right? This fighter of a politician. And So Roosevelt is going to go on to become like governor of New York. He's going to become secretary, like a junior secretary in the Navy. He's going to get involved in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, and it's actually his involvement in the Spanish-American War in Cuba that's going to vault him into the upper echelons of political fame. So and we kind of talked about how the newspapers followed around Roosevelt's unit, the Rough Riders, in the Cuban-American War. Because Americans are just fascinated with the story of Roosevelt, and looking at his background and his embracing of this attacking, the corrupt interests, the progressive elements of the Republican Party are really going to want him to become sort of this nationally prominent politician. So our conservative friend, William McKinley, who's all about the gold standard, is going to pick Roosevelt as his running mate in the 1900 election. So McKinley's going to win, right? He's going to beat the Democratic candidate in 1900. And so McKinley's going to become the Republican president. Roosevelt is going to become the vice president. McKinley was much more conservative. Roosevelt was very much a young progressive, right? Well, the accidental president comes about because McKinley gets shot just a few months into his second term. So just like about a year after Roosevelt gets elected to the vice presidency, he becomes the youngest president in American history at 42 years old. And this is going to just absolutely throw conservatives for a loop, the fact that they have this progressive president now. So Roosevelt's particular brand of progressivism is kind of interesting. So he's going to have a reputation as a bit of a firebrand, right? Somebody who's not afraid to go after the people where he sees it. But in practice, as president, Roosevelt is going to be much more cautious and try to only do reasonable reform and reasonable change, right? So he's going to be quite thoughtful about where he chooses to try and enact reform. And Roosevelt's kind of central way of thinking about trusts was that big business is okay, but corrupt business is not. So we need to regulate the big businesses. We can allow them to get big, but if they start to act corrupt, then we need to break them apart. So Roosevelt's program as president, he referred to as the square deal. And basically what Roosevelt means by this is, I'm going to largely let businesses go free as long as they don't act in a corrupt way. So you are going to get what your actions deserve, right? If you act in a way that's productive and good, then the government will support you. But if you are corrupt, and if that means you're a business or a labor union or a person and you act corrupt, then Roosevelt's going to drop the hammer on you. And that's the square deal, right? You get a square deal, the fair deal. So a few things that Roosevelt does. In 1902, Roosevelt breaks apart this brand new trust called the Northern Securities Company. And this was put together by our banker friend, J.P. Morgan. It was going to be a huge, like hundreds of millions of dollars valuable company that was going to unite tons of different aspects of the railroad. And it definitely was probably going to be one of these corrupt trusts. And so Roosevelt sued basically this company and broke them apart. And this gave Roosevelt a reputation as a trust buster, even though Roosevelt didn't tend to break up a lot of trust, right? This was just one example of where he did so. So this is actually going to get Roosevelt in a little bit of trouble with J.P. Morgan, one of the biggest, most powerful, business tycoons. So Roosevelt's reputation definitely going to be enhanced in this situation. But Roosevelt wasn't just going after big trusts, and we see that in the United Mine Workers Strike episode of 1902 as well, where in Pennsylvania, a labor union called the United Mine Workers is going to strike against the owners of the mine, and neither side is going to bargain in good faith. And so this strike is going to go on and on and on. Meanwhile, the coal isn't getting mined, so a lot of Americans are starting to run out of fuel, and winter starts approaching. So it becomes necessary to get these mines working again. Well, neither side is willing to come to the table. And Roosevelt steps into this debate. And he says, guys, neither of you are bargaining in good faith. You need to figure it out. Basically, kids, don't make me pull this car over. And so he is going to say, I would like to step in and give you impartial arbitration by the government. And neither side gives in to this. And so Roosevelt basically loses his patience and says, okay, if you guys don't give in to this demand, mine workers, I'm going to make your activities illegal. And mine owners, I'm going to use the Marines to come in and take over your mine and use the government to operate it. So if you don't come to the table, both of you guys are losing your position. And so the mine workers and the mine owners come together, settle an agreement that gives the mine workers an increased wage and a shorter workday. So again, that's an example of the square deal, right? Roosevelt wasn't afraid to go after even labor unions if they weren't operating in a fair manner. Another thing Roosevelt is going to do is he's going to pass the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1907. And this was influenced by a novel that he read called The Jungle, written by Upton Sinclair, which is going to talk about some meat packing plants that do terrible things, like put really gross stuff in their meat. And what Roosevelt is going to do in this Pure Food and Drug Act is he's going to make it so that by law, if a company sells a food product or something that you consume, they have to clearly label what's in that product, and that label has to be accurate. And if it's not accurate, that company can be sued. Okay. Another thing that Roosevelt is going to do, another way that Roosevelt is going to use the federal government as a tool, is to conserve and preserve federal land. So to conserve means that he's basically going to put this federal land under federal protection, and they're going to manage the land so that they can still use the resources of the land, but in a way that's sort of sustainable, right? So this notion of sustainability hadn't been something that people really took seriously before. And so the fact that you could manage land in a sustainable fashion, Roosevelt used the government to put millions of acres of federal land under these sustainable practices. But Roosevelt also was dedicated to preserving land as well. And so under Roosevelt, you start adding lots more land to the national park system to keep this land and not use its resources, but just to preserve its nature, right? Roosevelt was an avid outdoorsman. He spent several years in his youth working on a cattle ranch in remote North Dakota. He loved going hunting and being outdoors. So in addition to kind of being an economic reformer, Roosevelt also reformed land use by the federal government. So despite enormous popularity, and Roosevelt was an incredibly successful, incredibly popular president, Roosevelt promised not to run for the presidency again, not to run for a third term in 1908, and so he steps back and allows his vice president Taft to assume the presidency. So when Roosevelt steps away from the presidency, he has really forever changed the way that presidency is going to function and operate. So as I've said before, progressives want to use the government as a tool to solve social problems. And so the fact that Roosevelt was such a vigorous, active presidency is kind of going to forever change Americans' expectations for how that presidency should function, right? The president should be very active, very powerful, and he needs to kind of be the central of American political life. So just how kind of we think of today as the president as being very powerful and kind of the center of American political system, that change is going to come about because of Roosevelt. So the guy that's going to come after Roosevelt is Roosevelt's vice president, William Howard Taft. And Taft, this is an interesting situation. So Taft, so Roosevelt as a president was very vigorous. He was very boisterous. He was a very energetic, active president. Taft, while he's going to be progressive and he's going to share many of Roosevelt's policy positions, personality-wise, Taft is very different from Roosevelt, right? Taft is a really big guy. He was like 6'2", 6'3", like well over 300 pounds. He was a really big dude, but he was kind of a gentle giant. And so whereas Roosevelt was a fighter, Taft was more of a calm type president. And Taft's background was actually as a judge rather than a politician. And Taft was much more introspective than Roosevelt was. He liked the quiet. He didn't like the combative nature of politics. And as a matter of fact, probably the biggest reason that Taft gets involved as a politician in the first place is because Taft's wife was brilliant and combative and loved politics. And if the times would have been different, Taft's wife probably would have been a very prominent politician, but she drives Taft to get involved in politics. And so Taft absolutely adored his wife and gets involved in politics to kind of satisfy his wife's desire to be at the center of the political world. And kind of unfortunately for Taft, his wife has a stroke about a month into Taft's presidency, and this just totally devastates Taft. So it's very, very sad, right? Taft's kind of this gentle giant, and his wife suffers a stroke. Taft and Roosevelt, however, were very close with one another. In fact, they were I would almost consider them like best friends, right? Where Roosevelt was very bombastic and forward going, Taft was a really brilliant at like sort of picking up the pieces behind Roosevelt and being a really able administrator and soft spoken and sort of a steady influence to Roosevelt's firecracker personality. So working together, they were a really good team. But when Roosevelt leaves the presidency in 1908 and Taft kind of comes to the fore, Taft is not nearly as effective as an actual the true leader. He's more of a background type person. He enjoys being in the background. So Taft is going to wind up being a very ineffective president, even though he was a very good partner for Roosevelt. So the big issue under the Taft presidency was tariffs. Now, in our populist chapter, we talked about the McKinley tariff and how that was the biggest tariff that had ever been enacted, that it was a 50% tariff on imported goods, which is a crazy high tax to place on imported goods. So by the Taft presidency, the progressives have kind of embraced this notion that if we want to reduce the power of these trusts, we need to lower the lower the tariff that is protecting these giant corporations. So Taft kind of embraces this project of lowering the tariffs. Now, the problem with tariff reform, and Roosevelt warned Taft not to touch tariffs because of this, the problem with tariff reform is that half of the Republican Party, like the progressive half of the Republican Party, really wanted tariffs to be lowered. But the Republican Party still had this enormously powerful constituency of the business owners, right? Your laissez-faire style business owners. And so removing that tariff would have been something the progressive Republicans loved, but the business and conservative Republicans hated. So Roosevelt said, Taft, don't touch tariffs, because if you do, you are going to split the Republican Party. Well, what does Taft do? He attempts tariff reform. And so he is going to pass something called the Payne-Aldrich tariff. And this is going to be a hard sell because it's going to cause lots of fighting between the progressives and the business Republicans. And in the end, just the fact that he tried to lower the tariffs is going to anger the business Republicans. But he's not going to be able to lower the tariffs by much at all. So the progressives are also going to be turned off because this tariff was kind of a tease a little bit. So going into kind of the last few years of Taft's presidency, he is going to be very unpopular, and the Republican Party is going to be fighting with one another because of this tariff reform issue. So Roosevelt, after he resigns the presidency, he goes on a safari trip in Africa for several years. So he gets out of the country while kind of Taft is busy messing things up. And when Roosevelt comes back in 1910, he is furious that Taft attempted tariff reform. And so whereas Roosevelt and Taft had considered each other best friends before, Roosevelt is going to start criticizing Taft over and over and over again. He's going to be furious with him. And Roosevelt is also actually going to put forth his name for the presidency, the Republican candidate for presidency in 1912, even though Taft had only served one term. So this is going to be a really unusual move in that you have a sitting Republican president, and the former president, the guy that came before him, is going to try to oust him as the next candidate for the presidency. So going into the Republican convention in 1912, Taft is going to have the support of the GOP party establishment. So sort of these conservative business Republicans are going to support Taft for president because that's just how you do politics. The sitting president is supposed to get the presidential nomination. However, much of the popular, the progressive element of the Republican Party is going to support Roosevelt for the presidency. Unfortunately for them, though, it is the party establishment that still exercises the most control in who gets nominated. So the majority of the Republican Party is going to support Roosevelt, but the influential members are going to nominate Taft for the Republican candidacy. So that's going to make Roosevelt and the progressive Republicans really mad, and they're basically going to walk out of the convention and go form their own party, a brand new party, a new third party, right? The Progressive Party, and they're going to nominate Roosevelt for the presidency. And when a journalist approaches Roosevelt and asks him, are you ready for this election? Roosevelt is going to say, "Yup, I feel fit as a bull moose," right? Which is going to give the nickname to the Progressive Party, the Bull Moose Party. Now, in what should give you a clue as to how powerful the progressive movement had become, the third major player in the 1912 election, the Democratic candidate, is also a progressive candidate. So the main Republican candidate, the third party candidate, Roosevelt, and the Democratic candidate are all progressive politicians. And Woodrow Wilson is going to be nominated by the Democrats as a progressive politician. And so it's shaping up to be this three-horse fight for the 1912 presidential election. And it winds up being pretty anticlimactic because the Republican vote is basically split between Roosevelt and Taft. The traditional Republicans vote for Taft, the progressive Republicans vote for Roosevelt, and so it's kind of interesting. The third party actually wins more votes than the Republican Party. The Progressive Party wins more votes than the Republican Party, but only because Roosevelt is their candidate. So if you look at that graphic, Roosevelt wins about 88 electoral votes. He wins what looks like 6 states and about 4 million popular votes. Taft only wins 2 states, 8 electoral votes, but gets about 3.5 million popular votes. And Wilson is going to just run away with this because the Democratic vote is united. So they win in most states. So he wins a pretty substantial popular vote majority, but a huge electoral vote majority. And so he is going to become the next president, or the third of our 3 progressive presidents. All right, so the third of our 3 progressive presidents is going to be the Democrat Woodrow Wilson. So Taft and Roosevelt, although they wind up being very combative with one another, their policy positions are generally pretty similar. Wilson is going to be a progressive, but a little bit different than both Taft and Roosevelt. So Wilson, his brand of progressivism is going to be called the New Freedom. And Wilson's, this is going to be called the New Freedom because Wilson is going to be focused on enacting reforms that allow economic freedom back to the average sort of everyday progressive. So examples of that. One thing that Wilson is going to argue is that unlike Roosevelt, who thought that bigness was okay, it's when trusts were acting corrupt that was a bad thing. Wilson disagrees. He says that all trusts, if they're big, they're sort of naturally and inherently inefficient, and that having these big businesses that control large portions of industries is going to choke upward mobility, right? If you have these big businesses, they can outcompete the small businesses. So you have to limit the size of all businesses. You can't let any business get too big. So that's going to be Wilson's job, is he's going to try to bust up a lot of the trusts that he sees, even though he still isn't going to get a lot of them, right? But he's going to do more so in that department than either Roosevelt or Taft did. The other thing, the way that Wilson is going to differ from Roosevelt and Taft is that he is going to argue for lowering the tariffs, right? And that's a pretty standard Democratic position in general. So Wilson is actually going to effectively lower the tariff pretty substantially from what it was in the McKinley tariff. So he's going to effectively do that. Another way that Wilson is going to govern as a progressive president is that because he lowers that 50% McKinley tariff, that's going to be a pretty substantial chunk of revenue that the government is going to miss out on, right? Money that the government isn't making in tariff taxes. So Wilson is going to try to make up for that lost revenue by enacting for the first time a income tax, right? And with the passage of the 16th Amendment, this is something that our federal government is allowed to do, is to implement an income tax. So under Wilson, the country enacts a 1%, so a range of income taxes, but the lowest being a 1% tax on any incomes over $4,000. So it means any dollar that you make over $4,000 is going to be taxed at 1%. And the highest tax rate will be 6% on any incomes $500,000 or over. So any dollar that you make past $500,000 is going to be taxed at 6%. So the final thing that Wilson is going to do, and I'm actually going to switch over to my whiteboard to explain this, is he is going to enact the Federal Reserve Act. I'm going to go back here for this to explain this a little bit. And you can see I've used this whiteboard for the previous chapter, but let's just go with this. So the Federal Reserve, taking a little break to talk about economics, the Federal Reserve is going to be the kind of the latest incarnation of a national bank. And so we've talked about these periodic boom and bust business cycles and the collapse of the banking sector and like the panic of 1893 and how that was a series of bank failures. And what Wilson is going to do is he's going to try to enact a central banking system that's going to try and stabilize the economy a little bit. So this is how the Federal Reserve works. Take a look at this. So average everyday people, right? Here's my stick figure. Person, 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 right? Average everyday Americans, when they want to store their money, they put them in banks, just like this, right? So bank one, you have more people right over here who also put their money in banks. Now, when you have a bank failure, that means that these banks, right, here, run out of enough cash to function. So these banks start to go bankrupt. Well, what Wilson does in establishing something called the Federal Reserve System. Okay, we're going to keep going on our drawing here. Is Wilson is going to create this Federal Reserve System that's basically going to function as a bank for banks. So he's going to set, I think, like 13 different regions in the United States, and each of these regions is going to get a bank, a Federal Reserve branch, right? And in these Federal Reserve branches, these private banks will keep a certain portion of their deposits with this Federal Reserve branch. So it's basically a bank for banks. And the thinking being, if one of these banks starts to go under, right, it has bad economic conditions, that Federal Reserve Bank can turn around and loan money, right? Loan money to this bank to keep it operating. So it's kind of a reserve bank in that function to kind of provide some stability in case banks start to fail. It can kind of prop up the banking system. So actually, if you guys go into like a bank today and you see a sticker that says these deposits are FDIC insured, what that means is that your bank is part of this Federal Reserve banking system, and any money that you have in that bank account, if that bank fails, that Federal Reserve will step in and reimburse you that money up to a certain amount. So again, right, this takes a look at a problem, right? The progressive in Wilson takes a look at a problem, which is bank failures and periodic depressions and economic crashes. And he says, we can prevent these with smart economic planning by forming this central bank, right? The Federal Reserve System that will be a lender of last resort for these private banks. So again, that is Wilson and progressivism. So finally, we are done with the progressive lecture. The overall effect of the progressive movement is a big change and really important and lasting reforms in the economy with the Federal Reserve System, in politics, right, with the state level and municipal level reforms, And also with the expectations of how presidents and governments need to function. They need to be more accurate in solving problems, right? In things like women's rights, in social justice. So although the progressives are never going to be as united as the populists were in the late 1800s, they're going to be a much bigger, much more profound movement who are actually going to get presidents into office, 3 of them, right? And the reforms that they enact are going to be present even today. So, all right, guys, that's the progressive unit.